Well, welcome everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome to 52 Weeks of Leadership, your weekly dose of leadership insight that is brought to you by the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness of the UB School of Management. My name is Paul Tesluk. I'm the Dean of the school. Great to see everyone and having you join us here today. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. But before doing that, I'd like to as we're kind of getting into the start of kind of a new academic year, we have two programs from the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness that I just want to bring to people's attention. The first is that we are launching a new cohort of the Leadership Accelerator program, which is a 6-session professional development leadership program offered by Chloe. And you can see the dates there on the screen. And we're also going to be starting the second cohort of the Leadership Coaching Certification Program. That also is going to be starting in September. And so more information, I think we'll be sending into the chat a link so that you can be able to look at more details in those programs. Encourage people to check that out. So I'm very pleased to be able to have the honor of introducing our speaker for this week. It is Professor Dan Laufer, who is an associate professor at marketing at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. And Dan is coming to us through New Zealand time, where it is very early on Tuesday morning. So Dan, thank you for rising so early to be with us, or maybe putting off your bedtime quite a lot, whichever way that is. Dan is a leading expert in crisis communications and has been for a number of years. In fact, we were kind of just chatting a little bit about this before everyone came on, that crisis communications has been a kind of an area of study and an area of importance for organizations and for leaders for quite some time, but particularly during, I think, what we've been seeing in the recent years during the response to COVID, to crises that it seems like organizations and CEOs and other organization leaders seem to be experiencing on a regular basis. Understanding how to be able to communicate effectively in the midst of a crisis is a critical leadership skill. And so we're really happy to be able to have Dan share some of his expertise on this. He's going to be talking about when should a leader be a spokesperson during a crisis. Dan received his PhD and MBA from the University of Texas at Austin and is a proud UB School of Management undergraduate alum. He received his accounting degree from us. So we're pleased to be able to have Dan come back virtually and be with us at UB as part of this series. As I mentioned, Dan is an associate professor. He's a professor of marketing, and he also served as former head of the school at Victoria University, one of the leading universities in New Zealand. And he is quite often sought after for his expertise and sharing his knowledge about crisis management and crisis communication. So again, we're thrilled to be able to have Dan here, welcome him back to UB virtually. And so Dan, I'd like to turn the floor over to you. And just for everyone in our audience, before you get started, Dan, if people do have questions, and we encourage questions, encourage you to put those into the chat. We will have a little bit of time at the end after Dan's presentation to have some Q&A, and I'll be moderating that. So Dan, without any further ado, welcome to 52 Weeks, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. It's a real honor. And, I have very fond memories from the time I was in Buffalo. And even though it is very early in the morning here in New Zealand, it's really a pleasure to give this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about whether a leader should be a spokesperson during a crisis. In terms of academic literature, a lot of studies focus on the message, what should be the right message during a crisis. But, surprisingly, not a lot of researchers have looked at who should be speaking during the crisis or who should be delivering that message. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And in terms of my research, I've focused on this through the angle of the CEO as a spokesperson during a global product harm crisis. Now, what does that mean, a global product harm crisis? So think of the Toyota crisis with the accelerator problem. So that happened all over the world. So Toyota had to manage that crisis, and there was a global product recall associated with it. And so what I examined was, when should the CEO be the spokesperson during that sort of crisis? Now, you know, the topic is much broader, and hence the title, who should a leader be a spokesperson during a crisis? So for those of you that aren't particularly, let's say, interested in product recalls and the global context, there's still takeaways from this presentation that I think will be useful to you. So let's start with the crisis that I'm sure many of you remember from over 10 years ago, and that was the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, I posed the question here in the slide: is it always a good idea to use the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis? And here's an example of when it backfired. And so what did Tony Hayward, the BP CEO, say? So you see here the quote: "We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused their lives. There's no one who wants this over more than I do. I would like my life back." I'm sure many of you remember this. And for those of you that don't, there's a video that you can see, a YouTube video. And really, this generated a lot of negative headlines for BP and the CEO. You know, the focus on himself, how he wants his life back, as opposed to, you know, the adverse impact of the oil spill on others. And so you can see that sometimes the CEO isn't the best spokesperson. And what I'm going to focus on in the presentation are some factors to consider in whether to choose a CEO as a spokesperson during an overseas crisis. And so what are these factors? So you have the characteristics of the spokesperson, you have the characteristics of the crisis, and then you have the characteristics of the audience. And in this case, or in terms of the research that I focused on, the consumers in overseas markets. So let's start with the characteristics of the spokesperson. What are some important things to think about? First of all, communication skills. And so when I give workshops here in New Zealand to mayors, this is something that I talk about. I talk about, number one, training. Training is very important, and to be prepared to speak during a crisis, and also just the natural ability to communicate. And the Prime Minister here in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, actually has both. A lot of people overseas don't know that her undergraduate degree in New Zealand is in communications, and she's also a natural communicator. She's very effective, particularly in communicating empathy towards victims. So that's an important consideration in whether you choose, or whether an organization chooses, to use the leader or the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis. Communication skills. The second thing is whether the CEO or the leader is a celebrity or a non-celebrity. Now, most CEOs and leaders are actually not that visible and wouldn't really fall under this category of celebrity, but there are a few that do. And if an organization has a CEO that's well known, the organization should consider using the CEO or the leader as a spokesperson during a crisis. So what are some examples of celebrity CEOs? So Elon Musk is a good example. Steve Jobs from Apple would have been a good example. And also Bill Gates from Microsoft. Now, whether they're well known or not, or whether they're celebrities, is one consideration, but also what they're well known for is important. And so that relates to brand associations. And so there are certain CEOs that are known for competence or getting things done. So Elon Musk would be a good example of that, Steve Jobs as well. And others are known for other things. So Bill Gates, even though lately he hasn't gotten very good publicity, but previous to that, he was pretty well known for his charitable activities. And that could be useful. And really, it depends very much on the crisis type. So if there's a crisis involving victims, it's very important to be able to express empathy and sympathy. And so someone who's associated with charitable activities could be effective in that sense. Now, crises are also associated with fixing problems. And so a product harm crisis, it's important to demonstrate that one has control over the situation and that one can correct what's wrong. And so if a CEO is associated with competence and getting things done, that could be useful during a crisis. And that should be considered in terms of whether one is chosen to be a spokesperson during a crisis. And finally, the next factor associated with characteristics of the spokesperson is a concept called the liability of foreignness. And this relates to social identity theory, this concept of people being part of the in-group or the out-group. And, in terms of my research, I look at overseas crises, so multinationals that have to manage crises in multiple countries. So a liability of foreignness comes into play. So if you have a foreign CEO, the audience could view that foreign CEO as someone from the out group. And there have been numerous studies that have demonstrated the disadvantage of being in an out group as opposed to being in an in group. And what emphasizes this out group status? Things like foreign accent, need for translation, cultural differences in body language, issues with language fluency. Now, large corporations are very much aware of this, and take Japanese corporations like Toyota. So when they have crises, like the acceleration crisis that occurred a couple of years ago, they utilize American executives as opposed to the CEO, the Japanese CEO, partially because of this liability of foreigners. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the characteristics of the spokesperson is something that's called common group affiliation, and that's also related to social identity theory. So it's not just a matter of belonging to a common nationality or country, which is a part of social identity theory and a type of group. But there are other groups as well, and we conducted some research in this area. So some of you may be familiar with the crisis that Mattel had to deal with a couple of years ago involving lead in toys manufactured in China. Now, the CEO of Mattel, when he was communicating, emphasized the fact that he's a parent to children. And what he's trying to do here is to create a common group between himself and the audience or other consumers. So it's not a matter of the CEO communicating to the public. He is trying to communicate as a parent to other parents. So that's what common group affiliation means. And in our research, we examine this, and this can be effective, but it's particularly effective when you have a small and homogeneous group as opposed to a large and heterogeneous group. Think of Harley Davidson and the CEO having a motorcycle, a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and communicating as a user of that product with other users of the product. We found that to be particularly effective in terms of communications. And this can, in certain cases, override the disadvantage, the liability of foreigners. So this is another consideration in terms of using the CEO as a spokesperson. Does he or she have a common group that can override that liability of foreigners? Okay, let me talk about the characteristics of the crisis. So it's not just about the CEO, it's also about the crisis. What sort of crisis are we facing? One factor that's very important is the severity of the crisis. And actually, we're seeing it now with Afghanistan. I was just reading the news, and President Biden is going to give a statement about the situation in Afghanistan. Now, this is a very serious and severe crisis, and up till now, the Secretary of State has been the spokesperson. But because of the severity, there's an expectation that the leader, or in a corporate sense, the CEO, needs to speak during a crisis. Let me give you another example. BASF is the largest chemical company in the world, sales of over $100 billion. It's a German company. Now, in an article that I published, I interviewed the head of corporate communications at BASF about a major crisis that they faced a couple of years ago. There was an explosion in their chemical plant in Germany. Now, they, of course, have a crisis management plan for a chemical explosion. And in that crisis management plan, it specified the spokesperson. And the spokesperson in the plan was the head of the plant where the explosion took place. And from a logical standpoint, it makes sense. The head of the plant would be very familiar with technical aspects of operations. And so in a crisis situation would be, a good person to communicate. However, the crisis that BASF faced in terms of that explosion in the chemical plant was very severe. There were people that were killed and injured. And when the head of the plant was a spokesperson, BASF was criticized by the public, who expected the CEO to speak. So that's a good example of how severity plays a role in terms of expectations of who should be a spokesperson during a crisis. Another factor is culpability. Culpability is who's to blame. If an organization is to blame for a crisis, the public expects the CEO to speak. And finally, the last one relates to the global context, the importance of the overseas market to the multinational corporation. If the country is an important market for the company, it's more important to send the CEO to that market to communicate as opposed to other markets which aren't as important. Here in New Zealand, we had a company had a major crisis, Fonterra. Fonterra is the largest corporation in New Zealand. It's a company that sells milk products. It's one of the largest exporters in the world. And they had a major crisis a couple of years ago involving a botulism scare in milk powder that was sent to customers overseas in multiple markets. And so the company sent the CEO to China to communicate because that was their most important market. So that's a good example of the third point. Okay, the last factor that's important to consider are characteristics of consumers in the overseas market, essentially the importance of considering the audience. And so the first factor, levels of ethnocentrism, relates to how the overseas market views a foreign spokesperson as opposed to a local one. Markets and countries that have high levels of ethnocentrism would favor someone that's local, so a local spokesperson would be more effective than an overseas CEO. Now, there are exceptions to that, and that relates to the country of origin effect. So you can have a general inclination to prefer domestic over international. However, in certain cases, country of origin effect can override that. And let me give you some examples. Here in New Zealand, the country is very well known overseas for ethical behavior and transparency. So that could be useful in a crisis situation. And in fact, the CEO of Fonterra, when he went to China, was very effective because China views New Zealand as a very ethical and transparent country. And so when he's speaking directly to the Chinese public, that has an impact. Other examples involve the concept of warmth and competence. There are countries that are viewed as more warm or more competent. And let me give you some concrete examples here that have been found in various studies. So Germany is viewed as a country that's very competent. So a German CEO speaking overseas, say in China or in India, is perceived by many to be someone who's very competent and able to fix problems. And so in a product harm crisis or in a product recall situation, that could help a company because people will be more likely to believe that the problem will be fixed. In terms of warmth, studies have found that Italy is perceived to be a very warm country, that people are very warm and friendly. Now, that could be very effective in situations where you have a lot of victims, and it's important to convey empathy and sympathy towards the victims. So an Italian CEO could be very effective in that sort of situation. And finally, the last thing, power distance orientation, and that relates to some research that we conducted in China and in South Korea. So there are certain countries that place more importance on hierarchy than others. China is a good example of that. Now, on the other hand, there are countries that don't place a very big importance or emphasis on power distance, and New Zealand is a good example of that. So in New Zealand, everyone is on a first name basis. Even the prime minister is Jacinda. Now, overseas, that would be unheard of. Also, in a university context, for those of you that remember your experience in the university, I remember as a student, I would never call a professor by his or her first name in the US, not in Germany either, where I've taught. However, in New Zealand, everyone is on a first name basis. And so in terms of power distance orientation in a country which has high power distance, it's better to send the CEO to be a spokesperson as opposed to one that's lower on power distance. And so a regular company spokesperson is sufficient. It's all about the message as opposed to the messenger. And we found that to be the case in our research in China and in South Korea, where they are more influenced by the CEO as a spokesperson. Okay, to summarize things, it's really important to take into consideration factors associated with the leader or the CEO, such as whether the CEO is a celebrity or not, whether the CEO has common group affiliations with the audience, in determining whether to use the CEO. Also factors relating to the situation, and the situation with regards to a crisis are things like the severity of the crisis and who's to blame for the crisis. As things are more severe, or if the company is to blame, there's an expectation that the CEO is a spokesperson. And finally, characteristics of the audience, whether the audience is, so in my case, I was looking at it in a global context, whether domestic is preferred over foreign, in which case a global CEO would not be the best person to speak. The local spokesperson would be better. Or in certain situations, the country of origin can be advantageous, and it could be of use for a company to take advantage of that. So some additional resources that you might find useful. I published a book chapter on the topic. That was published in 2020, and there's a link to it. And also I was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal on both of the studies that I conducted related to the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis. That's available online. And there's also commentary from practitioners on the topic as well in that Wall Street Journal article. So thank you very much for attending my presentation, and I'm really looking forward to hearing questions.
Hey, thank you, Dan. That was really interesting. Thanks. Looking at the factors, kind of the CEO factors and the situational factors, you provided this really helpful framework for understanding when the CEO should serve as a spokesperson in a crisis. Your presentation's already generated a few questions, and I'd encourage others to chime in with questions that they might have as well. And again, to please consider posting them in the chat. As a follow-up, Dan, a question from Ron Hamilton, which I think is a really good one. And he points out that crisis communication, almost by definition, happens under crisis conditions, which means it's very dynamic in terms of how it unfolds. It happens very quickly. It happens often without warning. So thinking about that and bringing your framework into this, are there ways that Ron puts it, I think a great way here, a playbook can be developed in advance so that you've got a kind of a framework that allows you, when a crisis does happen, to be able to use the right approach, following this framework that you've outlined for us?
Well, what's important here is flexibility and sensitivity to the situation. So, what I talked about BASF and what happened to them. So you have to be prepared on the one hand, but you have to also be flexible to adapt to a changing environment. And so in the case of BASF, a chemical explosion in a chemical plant is a risk that they have to be prepared for. There's a crisis management plan for that. But in terms of communications, so it was very logical for them to choose the head of the plant as a spokesperson, because the head of the plant is knowledgeable from the technical standpoint of the operations. But what that doesn't take into consideration is expectations of the public. The public doesn't necessarily accept that. The public views the leader as the one who needs to be communicating with them in certain circumstances, and those circumstances are, related to the severity of the crisis. And so here there's a framework, but it's something that involves judgment as well, because when you go through the various factors, there are certain factors that would indicate, okay, the CEO should be the spokesperson, and others that indicate, no, the CEO shouldn't be a spokesperson. So one of the things that I say is, it's a judgment call. It's not yes or no, black or white. And because of that, take with artificial intelligence and robots and, a lot of discussions around, well, do we need humans making decisions? In this case, yes. And there's no right or wrong. It's just better informed decisions. That's the way I would frame it. And this sort of framework, enables to have a discussion about whether a leader or a CEO should be speaking during a crisis. And so, taking the case of Biden, and I've been following this, it's a very kind of disturbing and, interesting crisis. What's happening in Afghanistan, the whole, him not being involved in the communications, and how there's this criticism about why is he silent? Why is he in Camp David? Is very much related to the framework. The severity of the crisis is really high. And so you expect the president to say something. And now he's saying something. Now he's going to say something, at least based on the media reports.
Yeah. As you were discussing kind of the importance of looking at this from the lens of effective decision-making and judgment, I was reminded of one of our colleagues, Natalie Simpson, who works in the area of crisis management, really more from an operations management standpoint. But I know what she does in working with organizations to prepare for adapting to unpredictable crises is kind of scenario planning and preparing and running various scenarios for unpredictable types of crises, even though you'll never see the kind of exact crisis that you're necessarily preparing for. It's allowing you to kind of use and apply the kind of the judgment and some disciplined frameworks, so that when the real thing does happen, you're doing it from a more principle-based kind of that's based on effective responses, rather than kind of knee-jerk reaction or letting other factors come in. Yeah. So another kind of interesting question, if we can take a couple more minutes. So Rick Steinberg is pointing out that when you look at how quickly things kind of from the spread of social media and communication, especially globally, and how that can be interpreted very differently across a wide range of different types of audiences and cultures, is there an assumption that when a crisis does happen, that it's going to be a global crisis versus a local or a regional crisis? I'm kind of interpreting the question a little bit here, but I think kind of what this is getting into is around, how would you adapt kind of the framework that you have based on kind of the scale and scope of the communication pieces of how that crisis might be unfolding?
Well, I mean, in terms of crises, it really, depends. There are a lot of different types of crises, and even with product harm crises, you can have product harm crises that happen globally that only occur in specific markets. So take KFC in China. A couple of years ago, they had a crisis involving their products with the supplier. There were issues of quality. So that is a crisis that was kind of isolated to China that really didn't impact them in the US. They used different suppliers. So that's one type of global crisis where the crisis isn't happening in just one, let's say, overseas market. Others can be global in nature. Volkswagen with the emissions crisis, so they had issues globally with their diesel vehicles. And in terms of the reaction globally, that's a very, very interesting and important issue. Different markets can react differently to a crisis. And in terms of how a company responds, they have to be very sensitive to the different audiences globally in the different markets. So let me give you an example of that with the Volkswagen emissions crisis. So what did Volkswagen do globally in terms of the emissions crisis? How did they treat customers? They treated customers differently in the different markets. In the US, the US customers got much more from Volkswagen than in Europe. And the company was actually criticized heavily in Europe for that. But what Volkswagen said was, listen, we are treating customers based on the laws in the different markets that we operate in. And so in the US, we're required to do more than what we're required to do in Europe. And so, but it's a very tricky issue, actually. We're looking into this issue from a research standpoint on a new research project that I'm conducting. So on the one hand, you have laws in the various overseas markets that need to be followed by a multinational, but at the same time, customers in these different markets look at things through the lens of fairness and equity. And so, a company like Volkswagen has to ask themselves, okay, should I be paying billions of dollars more to compensate people that I don't have to necessarily compensate, as opposed to, will I lose these customers? Will they not buy Volkswagen vehicles in the future? So it's a very, very tricky and complicated issue.
Yeah, I can see that, but I think your response, it kind of shows the important nuance that you have to take and thinking about how to adjust the response based on kind of regional considerations, back to your point about understanding your customers and the different markets and expectations that you, as a global company, that you might be in. So I think that's a really good point. Something else, if I can ask a question that was going through my head as you were presenting, in particular, as you were talking about the CEO characteristics, it made me wonder around the degree to which, my experience with many CEOs is that they are often highly self-confident, that they want to be able to be in charge, particularly in a situation like a crisis. And so, even kind of applying kind of the framework and using effective judgment and decision-making, I'm interested in whether you have kind of seen that in some of your research, or maybe it's just more anecdotal about the importance of some of those factors, like whether it's hubris or whether it's inflated self-efficacy or other things that, or maybe emotional intelligence or other kind of characteristics of CEOs that influence the extent to which they engage in making the right decision with respect to how they step into that role or step back and allow someone else to do that when the circumstances warrant it.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's a big issue. Now, in terms of my research, I haven't looked at that issue directly. but in terms of my conversations with communication executives, this is a major issue. That CEOs are very self-confident, and so in many instances, the communications experts are giving advice to the CEOs that's being ignored. And so I talked at the beginning of the presentation about the CEO of BP and what he said over 10 years ago, which hurt the company, and ultimately he had to resign. But from a training standpoint, when I teach my crisis management courses and seminars, I use this as a learning opportunity for executives. And what I say is, it's very easy to say, oh, the CEO, what a terrible guy that he said this, and to just dismiss it at that. But there's a way of looking at it from another perspective. Perhaps the CEO wasn't shielded from commentary during a crisis, because during a crisis, he's under a lot of stress. And it isn't a good idea for a CEO to be accessible all the time to the media, because really what he said, of course, he shouldn't have said, but what he said, a lot of people think. A lot of people do want their lives back when, when they're going through tough times. And so it's not as if, what he said isn't, something that others are thinking. The mistake he made was saying it, during the crisis in such a public manner. And so, that could have been caused by a number of factors. One being the CEO being very confident in, thinking he's a great communicator and can do everything on his or her own, and not listening to advice. And from my conversations with communication experts from a lot of different types of organizations, government organizations, as well as corporations, CEOs a lot of times aren't willing to listen to the advice. And the consequences can be very significant for organizations.
Yeah, and it reminds me of something we were having a short chat on before the start about crisis management as part of what many executive coaches are finding, that there's an interest and a willingness from senior executives to be open to kind of coaching and advisement around that topic. Just for the important reasons that you're pointing out.
Now, I'll give you another example. So I teach workshops with mayors here in New Zealand. And I remember a mayor, when I was talking about the importance of preparation before an interview with the media, said to me, oh, I don't like to prepare. I like to just wing it. And it makes me more authentic. And, it's very hard to argue with certain people who are very confident and not willing to listen to the evidence, research, and only, when you make a mistake, and when you make a mistake, it's a very costly way to learn. Do you see that actually there is a lot of, value in training and education before you get out there and you start speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you. This has been an outstanding presentation. I know we all learned a lot on this topic, and appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us, and want to thank everyone for joining us. So I think what we'll do is we're going to kind of wrap things up. And again, thank you, Dan, for joining us on 52 Weeks of Leadership. We'll let you be able to kind of get back with your early Tuesday morning, and appreciate you being part of this, especially with the time zone difference. And so encourage everyone to join us for next week, where we're going to have Professor Chuck Lindsay, who is in one of our faculty in Department of Marketing in the School of Management here. is going to be talking about the role of analytics, particularly with respect to its implications for the future of work and leadership, and encourage everyone to join us next week for that. So thanks everyone again. Thank you again, Dan, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Bye.